When the first John Wick movie came out, I thought nothing of it initially. The trailer didn't really sell me on the premise, and I'm not a big movie person to begin with. The prospect of watching what appeared to be a generic action movie didn't appeal to me. Then I saw a certain fight scene that I can't really show because of copyright, but it impressed me, and I immediately decided to watch it. In the end, I was pleasantly surprised by its action and sense of humor, and like many, I hopped aboard the John Wick hype train. A train that's been running for 4 movies now, and is now set to release a TV spin-off. Why do I bring this up? Well, for starters, we are talking about John Wick Hex, a mini-strategy game developed by Mike Bethel Games Limited, and of course is based off the popular movie franchise. Set up as a prequel, it tells the tale of John Wick going up against a man named Hex, who, long story short, just really doesn't like the high table and wants to destroy them so that he can be free, or something along those lines. Oh no, the plot of a John Wick game isn't all that deep and important, but the purpose of my opening spiel wasn't just to be a cheap intro, because much like the first movie, John Wick Hex is a game I wasn't expecting much out of, and ended up pleasantly surprised with. What's the gameplay loop? You move through levels by traveling along a grid, for lack of a better term, and manage resources like ammo, health, and a focus meter to get to the end of the level. Levels are broken up into multiple stages, and resources carry over through each stage and reset at the start of each level. Pretty simple. Right off the bat, I appreciate that this game feels conceptually thought out. It's no secret that movie and TV-based games are often very good. This has gone better with time, but not by much. The problem often ends up being that the devs, either because of lack of vision or time constraints, make something generic. John Wick Hex, however, feels inspired. Like they actually had an idea for a John Wick game as opposed to the idea of making a John Wick game. Most other games opt to put you in the shoes of the protagonist, whereas John Wick Hex tries to put you in the mind of the protagonist. To succeed, you need to think, act, and barely emote like John Wick. Emphasis on barely emoting because John Wick doesn't have a single line of dialogue in this game. They just chose to make him silent because they obviously couldn't get Keanu Reeves to voice some lines. He was too busy doing Cyberpunk. Actually, I don't know if that's true. Either way, it's a bit of a letdown, especially because Lance Reddick and Ian McShane show up to reprise their roles as Winston and Sharon. The gameplay here is about encouraging the player to make the most out of their movements and to get to the end taking as little damage as possible. What does that look like in practice? Well, as you move throughout the level, enemies and threats will show up to kill you. Naturally. Ideally, you want to kill them before they can touch you, but obviously it's not that simple. For starters, everything functions on a timer at the top of the screen. Here, you can see how your and the enemy's actions are going to play out. This is your main tool for success. Learning how to best use the timeline to your advantage is the difference between life and death. Different moves in your arsenal have different execution times, and it's up to you to determine the best move forward. So, a basic example would be melee moves. You have 3 main abilities: a takedown, a strike, and a parry. Takedowns do the most damage and have the largest stun window, but obviously take the longest to execute. Strikes are less so, but quicker, and parries don't even really do damage, they're just to interrupt an enemy attack so that you can execute something else afterwards. This basic sense of time also carries over to the guns. Weapons like Uzis and pistols have lower accuracy and damage, but quicker fire rates, allowing you to interrupt enemy attacks if they land. Meanwhile, weapons like assault rifles and shotguns have longer execution times, but damn near perfect accuracy and do tons of damage. On the surface, it might seem like the best weapons would be the more powerful ones, but because a successful shot will interrupt enemy attacks, it becomes a question of what do you want? A gun that's going to kill an enemy faster, or a gun that's going to allow you to beat the enemy to the punch? Popping off attacks before the opponent does is only part of the equation. Another important aspect to playing the game is making a great use out of sight lines. Whatever isn't within John Wick's view is blacked out. Anything in the blacked out area can neither be seen nor attacked, and vice versa. Now, if it's an enemy you have already revealed on the map, a little icon will appear when they are out of sight to let you know where they are and keep track of their movements. which honestly is such a useful feature as it allows you to still plan while not fully knowing what's going to happen next. Breaking sightlines is also a good way of avoiding damage and interrupting enemy attacks. There will often be times when moving behind cover is much more preferable to trying to attack first. There's also a crouch and roll that you can use. Crouch not only ups your accuracy, but allows you to use waist-high objects as cover. The disadvantage being that you can't melee while crouched, and you can only move by rolling, which costs focus and energy of sorts used to manage actions like dodging, parries, and takedowns. Side note, you can also dodge melee moves by moving out of the way. This sometimes is your best option as it's more guaranteed and faster than most melee attacks. But of course, like rolling, it costs focus. Surely there has to be more to the game than that, right? Well, yes, but not by much. But I guess I could talk about the resource distribution. So, as I said earlier, the game is broken up into levels with multiple stages for each level. Supplies do not reset between stages, but do between levels, which I like because it forces the player to think things out on a long-term basis. You start off each level with a handgun and 1 extra mag and 2 bandages. As well, the beginning of levels will ask you to spend points on various buffs that range from making you a harder target to hit, honestly a must, to extending your push range, to decreasing focus costs for certain actions. But also, and I just found this out after beating the game like a dingus, you can spend points to stash extra ammo and bandages strategically throughout the stages. When you run out of ammo, and you will, you can always pick up another gun off a fallen enemy. So, there is no real concern in that regard, just be careful not to get caught up in a scenario where you need to pick one up while being attacked. The pickup time leaves you very vulnerable. What you have is what you got, and it's up to you to do the best with what you can. Now the focus meter is a little bit different as it's a meter that affects your ability to dodge, roll, parry, and take down, but it can be replenished at any time with a click of a button. There is no penalty for doing so outside of a few in-game seconds it takes to pull off. Which, don't get me wrong, does make it sound easy to abuse, and surely it could be abused under the right circumstances, but using this thing more organically, i.e. when it gets low instead of just replenishing after every kill, does make the game a bit tense at moments. Getting stuck in a scenario without focus and not being able to do a takedown behind cover or roll is honestly a situation you do not want to be stuck in this game. Ignoring it and not cleverly refocusing in combat can lead you in some pretty crappy situations, and for that I like how it's implemented. 2 other moves you have in your arsenal are push and throw gun. Push I hardly found useful outside of one moment where I used it to isolate an enemy from a crowd to avoid damage. Other than that, it was mostly useless. Throw gun, on the other hand, is actually a very useful move for interrupting enemy attacks and stunning them so that you can close the distance. There is a risk to using this move though. It has a chance to miss, and using it at the wrong moments can leave you vulnerable. But the benefit being that it takes less time to execute than shooting. And when it clicks, it clicks. Moving behind cover before I get hit, strategically using roll to get out of otherwise bad situations, strategically using takedowns to eliminate foes while keeping myself in cover, beating enemies to the punch. It's all good fun, especially when you start stringing these actions together. Those are the things about this game that really work for me, and yet I do think this game is ultimately held back by a handful of flaws and missed opportunities. When it comes to missed opportunities, I think it's a shame that this game didn't play around with environmental hazards or takedowns. Like, imagine throwing a guy into some glass and it breaking, causing the area around it to become more dangerous to walk on. Maybe from a gameplay standpoint, it's harder to dodge while you are on it. I think that would have been a cool idea. Or what about an electrical box that you can destroy and has a random chance to hit enemies around it? Or explosive barrels you can shoot to take down multiple enemies at once? You know, something that adds a fun dynamic to the levels, because the levels are probably the weakest aspect of this game. I also think it would have been cool to have an option to throw enemies into each other. You know, tie it into the focus meter and make it something that can be used as a stunning tactic. I also think it's weird that there's not any, like, loadout system. You can only start with the pistol, and though I recognize it's probably for the best, as if you let players, you know, load in with a shotgun from the get-go, you could possibly just break the game. But I also feel like it should have at least been an option for repeat playthroughs. Like, you beat the game and then you can just go back and play with whatever gun you want. Or, tie it into the upgrade system at the start of levels. Make players choose between upgrading abilities or upgrading their arsenal. Then there is the replay feature, which honestly suffers big time from this being an indie game. The idea here being that once you beat a level, you can watch your actions play out in a smooth, movie-like sequence. But this is far from smooth. The animations in this game are stiff, which isn't so much a problem when you're playing the game, but during replays, it makes the entire thing come off really janky. Like, just really, really janky. Now, to be fair, I get it. This game's low budget, and getting the kind of animation quality that most AAA games have requires very expensive motion capture technology. And if I'm being honest, after a while, the jankiness kind of becomes endearing, like it's kind of funny to watch. But still, I can imagine a version of this game that had better animation, and honestly, I wish that version of this game exists because it would have been cool to watch this stuff play out in a cool sequence that wasn't so weird looking. I think the one thing I can criticize regardless of budget is the fact that you have no control over these replays. Every camera angle and cut is generated by the game, and that makes it feel like a missed opportunity to let the players create their own John Wick action sequences. Honestly though, all those criticisms pale in comparison to the bosses, which are laughably bad. Like, laughably bad. Okay, so I'm about to show you how a typical boss fight in John Wick Hex goes. They show up, you run up to them, you mash strike over and over to deplete their focus, and then you shoot them dead. And that's all the boss fights in John Wick Hex. The first boss kinda presented a challenge, but that's only because they spawned in mobs to deal with you. Because I love spending a boss fight fighting everything else but the boss itself. I'm looking at you, Resident Evil 4 Remake Sadler, you piece of fucking trash. But outside that first encounter, they're really easy. They don't use special tactics, they don't counter your moves, they just stand there and let you spank them like an obedient whore. But yeah, that's John Wick Hex. Crazy to think that the movie franchise has gone as popular as it has. Again, something I never would have guessed watching that first trailer. Sure, have the movies gone silly? Oh yeah, they have. And by silly, it feels like they abandoned the more grounded aspects of that first film, and now it's just a live-action comic book. John Wick is just a comic book character now. Even the art style of this game acknowledges that. And my hope is that if they ever do a sequel to this game, they would fix all the problems I mentioned with the lack of level variety, lack of environmental interaction, and lack of a video editor. And I hope they would fix the animations, of course. I want better animations next time around. But also, I hope that if they create a sequel, that they lean more into that comic book attitude of the later movies, because for as much as I love that first movie, it's personally my favorite in the entire franchise, I think the off-the-wall shit they introduce in later movies is perfect for video games. Give us some wacky villains with special abilities, give us levels that change the way you move about them, and make bosses that don't just sit there and let you beat the crap out of them. Do that, and you would have an amazing little strategy game. But whatever, the game's still pretty enjoyable. It's a nice little game to kill time in for a few days before moving on. There is a second difficulty mode where time moves every 5 seconds regardless of your actions, but I don't have the patience for that. I have a hard rule about playing hard modes in games, that being that I have to absolutely love a game to be willing to put myself through its harder difficulties. Like, what do I have to prove by playing a game I don't absolutely love on its hardest difficulty? Nothing. No one cares. So yeah, that's John Wick Hex for you. A decent game held back by what feels like a lack of budget, but ultimately still good because at the very least the devs made an honest attempt to create something that really captures the property instead of just spitting out some generic piece of crap.